3 minutes. So don't be alarmed if you just hear silence and see people making strange faces. So give us 3 minutes. Thank you. For those of you that have recently joined, we'll be starting at 11:03. Thank you. And we'll be starting in just 1 minute. Thank you, everyone. All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to New York Counts 2020 Rebuilding New York Census as Foundation Conference. We are so excited to have put this week together. I'm Mita Anand, the Census 2020 Senior Fellow at the New York Immigration Coalition. And in that role, I also serve as facilitator and convener of New York Counts 2020, the statewide coalition of organizations working for a fair and accurate census in New York. We have an incredibly exciting week ahead of us, at least exciting for those of us that think census is exciting, which I would hope is everyone who's joined us. And to kick off this fabulous week, we have someone that already in our chat has been described as a census soldier, and that is Senator Zelnor Myrie from District 20, state senator, and he represents Brooklyn, and he is the chair of the Senate Election Committee. And I was telling him a brief story right before we went live, which is I recently was listening to his voice early morning on the What's Next Slate podcast, where he was speaking about some of his experiences during the protests. And he is such a census soldier that even though he was on to talk about that experience, he made sure to mention the census at the end of the podcast. And I think part of that is because the senator understands how all of this is interrelated. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Senator.
Thanks so much, Mita, and I'm really honored to be here with an esteemed panel. I like being on panels where I'm the least smart person, and that is certainly the case here. So there will be a lot to learn from the folks that will speak after me, but I'm very grateful for this opportunity to kick off this conference to talk about rebuilding in the context of getting our census numbers up. So I represent Central Brooklyn. I have 9 neighborhoods in Central Brooklyn. I have Crown Heights, Prospect, Lefferts Gardens, East Flatbush, Brownsville, Prospect Heights, Park Slope, South Slope, Gowanus, and Sunset Park. I was born and raised in my district. I absolutely love it, but my district has always been undercounted in the census. And that is an unfortunate reality that we contend with, not just in the 20th senatorial district, but really throughout the nation and in communities of color in particular. And so it is really my mantra to talk about the census wherever I go. It has been my passion because without getting the adequate numbers, our communities will continue to be at a disadvantage. I was thinking last night about what I might say to kick this conference off, and I thought about all of the things that have happened in the past couple of months that are completely out of our control. We have a once-in-a-century pandemic that has ravaged communities all over the world, but especially communities of color. We have hospitals that have been overrun. I represent 4 hospitals in my district where we saw things that no one wants to see. We put pressures on our frontline workers, unlike what we've seen in this country's history. And we saw budget cuts in the midst of that pandemic out of our control. We have an education system that has been seriously damaged by this pandemic, with the shift to remote learning, putting pressures on teachers and parents and kids. But of course, all of that was out of our control due to COVID-19. Even within the census's infrastructure, we have seen some at the top of this federal administration make certain appointments that are out of our control, but could have a disparate impact on the census count. But I am not hopeless, even though we are in a hopeless time, because there is one thing that is in our control, and that is making sure that everybody is counted. It is literally in our hands to do this. And I believe deep down that if all of us are committed to reaching every single corner of this city to ensure that we are counted, we can make it happen. I like to say that the census is about money, power, respect, and our communities that have been disrespected, that have had their power stolen from them, that have not had the investment that they deserve. This is our opportunity to fight back. We are, of course, in unprecedented times. People are going through struggles that many of us have never contemplated. Many of us never anticipated being in this situation. But this is the one thing that we can do to help combat this adversity. And so I am proud to be a census champion. My colleagues call me Mr. Census. I wear that title proudly because our communities really need it. Now, my neighborhoods, unfortunately, the ones most impacted by COVID-19 are the ones that are the most undercounted. And in Senatorial District 20, we are at about a 51% census completion rate. And in some of my census tracts in Brownsville and East Flatbush, parts of Crown Heights, and in Sunset Park, we're hovering between 30 and 45% completion rate. These numbers are abysmal. They're unacceptable. If they hold, our community stands to lose. And so you have my dedication. I know politicians make promises, but I'm making good on this promise that I'm going to give every single fiber in my being to make sure that we get those numbers up. And so I need all of us on this call to make that same commitment that you are going to give us everything you have so that the next 10 years are better than the last 10. So I'm so grateful again to be on this panel. Thank you for allowing me to speak to everyone, and I look forward to hearing what folks have to say.
Thank you so very much, Senator. So before we go on to our panel of the day, I just wanted to give a little framing to everyone as to the genesis of this week's conference. I think, though Steve Romalewski, who's on our panel, will be speaking to this, but and so will Amit, but just so everyone knows where we stand. In the United States, the self-response rate as of yesterday was 62%. 62% of households have self-responded to the census. That means they filled out the questionnaire themselves before anyone came knocking on the door. In New York State, that number is 57.6%. That makes us 38th in the nation. Now, I'm a proud New Yorker. I too was born and raised in New York, and I've never, for one, been proud of saying I'm number 38. I don't even like saying I'm number 2. I like saying I'm number 1. At the very least, we need to hit the average, which is 62%. And New York City lags New York State at 53.3%. I recently penned an op-ed that ran in the Times-Union about exactly what the senator was speaking about, the ravages that we're facing. We have twin disasters right now. The twin disasters are, well, 3 actually, if you want to think about it, but you've got the pandemic and its medical ramifications, the financial implications of that, and then I wouldn't call it a disaster, but something we're coping with, which is like structural inequality, structural racism, systemic inequality in our society. So how do we talk about census in the face of that? And the point is, we don't want the census to lead to yet another disaster. We need the census to be successful so that we can start to rebuild. And as we rebuild equitably. And by that, we mean we're ensuring that undercounted communities are no longer undercounted, so that going forward, we're not looking at a cycle where they continue to be under-resourced and underrepresented and not being able to demand accountability. So the good news is, in the recent weeks, New York State's response rate has been growing faster than that of the country's. The bad news is it's not doing it quite fast enough. We need to accelerate that pace. And ideally, we need to step it up between now and August 11th, because August 11th is when we're going to have the enumerators, the census door knockers, come to the door. And certain communities, we all know this, they will not want to open the door. And it's going to be even harder in the time of COVID, because I don't know which one of us wants to open our door to a stranger at this time when we're barely opening it to our friends and family. So we decided we'd put this conference together in light of that timeline to equip people, motivate people, and energize people so that we're getting ourselves there. We're giving it our all, every fiber of our being, as the senator said, until August 11th. Now, our work is not done then. The census is till October 31st, but really do a hard push until then. So we start with today, let's rebuild equitably. And we have speakers that are going to talk about how they're helping to do that and why they believe the census is the path to a better future for New York. Tomorrow, we're going to hear from industry leaders talking about how it intersects with their sectors and why they believe the census is important and what they've been doing. On Thursday, we're going to talk redistricting, which is the next step. When we say we need to count everyone, that feeds into the next step. The next step is redistricting, and that really determines the geographic region of who represents whom. So that is actually our step to accountability. And then Friday, we're just going to bring it all together with workshops on the various tools to conduct outreach and head out with a bang. We're going to have Vinita Gupta of the Leadership Conference speak to us and give us a call to action on that day. So we're really excited about this week. For today, I'm personally really excited. I am surrounded on this panel by people I've come to view as friends, in addition to extraordinary people working so hard on the census. We're going to hear from each of them for about 7 minutes, and then I will be asking follow-up questions. And then if people have questions, please put them in the chat, and we will look to answer them as possible. I will introduce each speaker right before they speak. So we're starting off with Steve Romalewski, who's the director of the CUNY Mapping Service. Anyone in census world has run out of superlatives to describe Steve, but all I can say is our work would not be possible without Steve's work. Steve puts together with his team the hard to count map that we all rely on in figuring out how our neighborhoods are doing. This is how we are able to say things like, this neighborhood is at 40%, while certain parts of the country, and this is not a lie, are above 80%. So Steve is a fantastic census I don't know. I don't even know what word to call them. God, census, deity. We're going to go with deity, and he's going to give us a sense of where we stand a bit further and really give us the context of how New York is doing. So Steve, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Mita. You're very kind. I'm just honored to be here and to be able to help organizations in New York and around the country to maximize the self-response rates and help ensure a fair and accurate census count. So I was hoping to share my screen. Don't seem to be able to do that, but if I can do that, I will. My plan is to give a bird's eye view using some of the visuals that my team at the Graduate Center at CUNY have put together that organizations around the country are using to understand the self-response rates. As Mita said, the self-response is so important because that ensures that the Census Bureau has the most reliable data. It's the least expensive way for the Census Bureau to collect information. And if you respond on your own, it ensures that a door knocker doesn't come to your door to try to count you in person, which, as she said, is challenging enough, especially challenging in the situation we're in now. So if I can, it says that I need the host to be able to allow me to share my screen. I'll show our map real quick to give an overview of New York State and also then some visuals to give you a sense of how all the counties and cities across the state are doing. As the senator said, you can imagine that even though there's an overall statewide response rate within the state, it's very much more varied. And so some areas are much higher, 60, 70% response. Other areas are very low. And across New York, in some ways, it's a microcosm of the rest of the country because we face a lot of the challenges in a more concentrated way here. So in addition to the ongoing challenges of trying to reach hard-to-count communities, the COVID crisis required the Census Bureau to suspend one of the very important operations that they had, where instead of mailing to households, they would drop off census packets that they were supposed to do in early March, and that was suspended and only recently resumed. And so in those communities, and you'll see on the map, if I'm able to share my screen, you'll see.
Yeah, we're just working on it right now.
Okay, great, thanks. You'll see that there are some counties that have very low response rates because in those places, many, if not most or almost all of the households did not even receive any communication from the Census Bureau at all until the last month or so in terms of how to respond. And so they're only now realizing, and it's so far past April 1st, when everyone thought of as Census Day, and that's when we should all respond by, that it's entirely possible that people have forgotten. And so, one aspect of kind of the overall perspective here is that because of the COVID crisis, here we go. Of course, we were able to, thank you very much, Mina and team, because of the COVID crisis, that completely upended all of the really great and amazing outreach efforts that census stakeholders around the state and around the country had planned. But what the Census Bureau decided to do is to extend the opportunity, the time frame by which people can, or householders can self-respond. And so that has given us an unprecedented opportunity to make sure that we boost self-response rates. And we'll see how that goes. So far, that has enabled the response rates to go up somewhat, but not as much as perhaps it could have, and I think that's likely because the challenges are still very great. And so, as Mita said, we do have more time throughout the rest of the month. The Census Bureau will be working closely with organizations around the country on to do a very targeted advertising and outreach campaign, in addition to all the outreach efforts that are being done. I think in New York, that'll be towards the end of July. And then we do have the opportunity to self-respond all the way through October 31st. And we've never had that amount of time. So we'll see how that goes. So you can see on the map that some areas, the counties that are highlighted on the map in New York, the ones in blue have above 50% response. self-response so far. The ones in orange and tan have less than 50% self-response. And you can see on the left over here the trend line of the response rates on a day-to-day basis. Maybe it's trite to say this, but you know, we were very successful in flattening the curve for the COVID crisis, but this is a curve that has kind of flattened, which is not a good thing. We want that rate to continue to go up and to boost self-response. You can zoom in on the map. You can see even more variation in detail if you zoom in more closely. If I go into here in the Syracuse area in Onondaga County, you can see some areas are doing very well. These are census tracts, and within the central part of the city is not doing as well, or the Onondaga Nation Reservation just to the south of the city. And again, the Onondaga Reservation is likely because of the Census Bureau suspending the drop-off of census packets in some areas, and only recently they've received those. So hopefully the map is helpful to give people a perspective on where they should be focusing their efforts, of course understanding the challenges, and to provide you some quantitative information on how that's going. We added a new feature recently that you can access via this data trends menu option at the top of the map, and I've already opened up the map to show the information for New York. And what this shows is each line on this graph is a county in New York State, and you can search for any county in the country. And each county line is color-coded based on the plurality or the predominance of housing units in the county that receive different types of contact from the Census Bureau in March to invite participation in the census. So the counties highlighted in purple are the plurality of units in that county receive the Internet First mailing. And so you can see most of the counties in New York, the Census Bureau sent a mailing to provide information on how to go online to fill out the census questionnaire. The lines in green represent counties that are predominantly Internet choice. So many of the households in those counties received the paper questionnaire in addition to the information on how to go online. And the orange ones, like this one down here, Hamilton County, are update leave counties. So the plurality of units received were to have received the packets dropped off at their doorstep. So the lines here give you a kind of a bird's eye view of which counties are doing really well. You can move your mouse over each line and see what the day-by-day response rates were. You can see which counties have increased recently, such as Hamilton or Sullivan, and you could also track to see if there are any outreach efforts that have been done that maybe have boosted the rates a little bit. You can also filter to say, all right, let's say for the Internet First counties, what are the rates for Internet only? And so you can see those are pretty high, but they've kind of flattened out compared with households that in these counties that have mailed in their responses. And you can see they're generally lower, but have been increasing in some places. So I think that speaks to the need for the Census Bureau to send out another paper questionnaire. We'll see if they do that as a reminder to these households. And then we highlight vertically some key dates. So when the day of action happened and when the update leave operation restarted and the like. So anyway, hopefully this information is helpful. It gives you an overview of what's happening throughout the state and which areas are doing better than others. And again, in a very localized way, how to focus your efforts. And also let me really quick show this county by county map that we've added, and you can see as you move the slider, you can see how each county changed, and you can also highlight, let's say, the lower responding counties rather, and you can see how they are they've continued, like Sullivan County here, with a low response rate. So this is another resource that you're free to use, and hopefully it will help guide your outreach efforts as we head into kind of the last few weeks of really sustained outreach to make sure that the self-response rates are boosted as high as they possibly can be. I'll pass it back to you, Mita. Thanks so much.
Steve, that was fantastic as usual. And we will be doing questions after all the panelists speak. So if you have questions for Steve, drop them in the Q&A or in the chat box. I know I have a couple of questions for him. So with that, I am going to next pass it to Amit Bugga, who is the Deputy Director for New York City Census. And he has done an incredible job in this role. He has kept us going through, the rough days, and the rough days being when we all were sent home in March. And he is going to give us a sense of what it is New York City has done and where he sees it going. So thanks so much, Amit, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Mita, for having me, and also for all of the incredible work you have done over the past year. I don't know how you do it. I think that between you and Larry, you have 10 days in a week and 30 hours in a day. So thank you for everything that you've done. So much of what we've seen in New York City is really the result of your leadership. Thank you also to the Senator for kicking us off. You really have been a true soldier and champion of the census. And without your leadership, I know Brooklyn would be certainly further behind than it is. So thank you so much to you. As the Senator mentioned in his remarks, the census really is about money, power, and respect. And this is something that the City of New York keenly understands and has understood when it comes to the 2020 census. This is why Mayor de Blasio last year, alongside with City Council Speaker Corey Johnson, invested an unprecedented $40 million in census outreach, education, and organizing here in New York City. Prior to this year's census, the City of New York essentially had never gotten involved in the process of ensuring that we had a complete and accurate count here in New York City, which really has left the city historically at a disadvantage. Both in 2000 and in 2010, New York City was very far behind the rest of the nation in terms of its overall self-response rate. And in 2010 in particular, New York City came in at just about 62% in the initial self-response rate, whereas the nation was 14 percentage points ahead of that. And so as a result, what we've seen is that here in New York City, we have not historically had access to our fair share of the money, power, and respect that we are constitutionally guaranteed and we are constitutionally owed. And so to correct this issue, the City of New York created the country's largest municipal coordinated campaign to ensure that we do have a complete and accurate count. We've had many different strategies that we've employed. We've been very, very fortunate to work with a very large number of partners throughout the city, most notably through the Complete Count Fund campaign, which is a campaign that consists of 157 different community-based organizations serving New Yorkers in 80 different languages across all 5 boroughs, really focused on ensuring that we have a very hyper-localized approach to census education, organizing, and outreach. It is by funding these organizations and making sure that they have the resources and tools and equipment that they need to be able to do work locally in their communities that we have believed we're going to achieve a complete and accurate count. Obviously, that whole process has been frustrated, complicated, and rendered really challenging by the collective experience that we've had with the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet, I have to say, we've been really, really heartened to see that of the 157 organizations that we've funded, the large majority have really tried to be as innovative and creative as possible in terms of how they've continued to conduct outreach to the communities that they serve. I'm going to speak briefly a little bit about some of the different tactics that New York City Census has employed, as well as some of our Complete Count Fund awardees. And then I would like to draw your attention to some of the disparities that we see very, very, very locally here in New York City that really can help us understand what the real challenges are here in New York City in terms of achieving a complete and accurate count, and specifically how linguistic and cultural barriers have created these challenges. So just in terms of some strategies and tactics, From the beginning of the campaign, we've known that we need to work with stakeholders across the city to ensure that we're raising awareness about the census, getting people to participate, and really fighting a lot of the fear and misinformation that's out there. We, by the end of this campaign, we will have invested $8 million in multilingual advertising across every platform you can imagine. This is essentially the largest campaign that the city has done to date. We have advertising in more than 20 different languages, running across social media, running across streaming platforms, more than 200 different websites, more than 24 television stations, more than 24 radio stations, basically reaching New Yorkers in every way you can possibly imagine. A key feature of this is that as soon as the pandemic arrived here in New York City, we pulled out more than $1.5 million of subway and bus advertising and repurposed that money to go primarily to digital television and radio, because we knew that New Yorkers were really consuming media differently. So we've tried to be as responsive as we can possibly be to the situations that New Yorkers find themselves in, to ensure that we're reaching them. Our advertising has really focused on the idea that the census is easy, it's safe, and that it's important, and that it is also for everyone. That the census does not ask about immigration or citizenship, it does not ask about income or Social Security. It is completely safe. All of your answers to the census are 100% confidential and protected by one of the strongest federal privacy laws on the books. And we've also really emphasized that the city of New York really needs census data in order to be able to make the decisions that we're going to need to make to determine how it is that we fully rebuild following the COVID-19 pandemic. When we are talking about issues of, for example, healthcare access, when we are talking about issues of, for example, affordable housing and education, without the complete data that we get from the census about how many we are, where we are, how old we are, the city of New York is not going to be able to make the decisions we need to make to understand where we need to invest in healthcare clinics, additional schools, and really what the future of affordable housing is going to look like in our city. The city over the past 6-7 years has made a lot of investments in affordable housing. The way those investments need to be made into the future is going to have to look different based on the ways in which the city has changed. We're not going to be able to make those decisions in a complete and informed way if we don't have the census data. So it is critical that we have a complete and accurate count here in New York City to ensure that the city can actually rebuild from the COVID-19 pandemic. I know I have just a couple of additional minutes, so I want to draw your attention to just how differently the tale of the census really shows up, even just within one borough, which is my home borough of Queens. I was born in the Bronx, but I'm now a Queens boy, and I'm going to draw your attention to a couple of neighborhoods in Queens. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Okay. I hope everyone can see my screen. And this is the wonderful map you just saw presented by Steve Romoleski, who we use this map every single day. I would say every single minute of every single day. We follow it very religiously, and it has been tremendously, tremendously helpful to us in our work. So I want to draw your attention to two different parts of Queens that really shows us that we have a tale of two censuses right here in our borough. The first part is Jackson Heights and Corona. Now, I'm assuming that most people who have tuned in are New Yorkers, have some degree of familiarity with the geography and the different neighborhoods of New York City. But right here, you can see that in the tracks in Jackson Heights, these dark blue tracks, we have census self-response rates that are between essentially 68 and 72%, which means that a very large percentage of the households in these tracts have self-responded to the census already. This means we have complete and accurate information about who lives in each of these households. And when the time comes for the city of New York to make decisions about the types of resources that Jackson Heights is going to need into the future, we're going to have the data that we need in order to be able to make those decisions. Contrast that with Corona, which is literally just about a 3-minute drive away from Jackson Heights along Northern Boulevard. In Corona, you can see that we have census tracts where the census self-response rate is just in the upper 30s, 37.5%. 38%. This means that the large majority of households in Corona have not responded to the census. Now, I have personally been out in Corona several times over the last 6 weeks, assisting New Yorkers who have been really impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic in filling out the census at food distribution lines, at nonprofits all over the neighborhood. And what we have seen is that in this neighborhood, which today is largely populated with Central American immigrants who in large part have very limited English proficiency, there are high rates of undocumentation. We are seeing that there are households that have 5, 8, 10 people, including grandparents, including children, that are living in one single household, which really shows us the disparity between a neighborhood that's just a couple of minutes away and Corona in terms of our understanding of what the realities are on the ground. And so when we're trying to rebuild from the COVID-19 pandemic and we're looking at Corona, which during the height of COVID-19 here in New York City was the neighborhood that had essentially the highest rate of infections, we are not going to have all of the data we need about who is living there, how old those folks are, how many people are living in a household, that's going to allow us to understand what are the healthcare clinics, what are the healthcare resources we're going to need to make available, what are the educational resources that we're going to need to be made available, and very importantly, what's the affordable housing that's going to need to be made available in this neighborhood that was so hard hit by COVID. And so this contrast really shows us that neighborhood by neighborhood, you can cross just a street and you're really seeing a completely different reality of the way in which New York City understands its own neighborhoods and its own people. And so that's why it's really critically important that we have complete and accurate data about every single neighborhood in New York City so we know how to invest our resources. In the last minute I have, I'll quickly draw your attention to another set of neighborhoods relatively close to Jackson Heights and Corona. These areas here, these sort of sky blue shaded areas, these are tracts in Kew Gardens. Kew Gardens, for the most part, is populated with single family homes. It tends to be middle class, upper middle class. You cross the street right here into Richmond Hill, and you find that it is a completely different reality with a census self-response rate at 38.8%, whereas the tract right next door is at 52.8. So this 20 percentage point difference really, again, is a tale of two censuses just across the street from each other. In Richmond Hill, you have a population that is largely Punjabi Sikh, Indo-Caribbean. Once again, another two sets of cultures that have not necessarily in Richmond Hill responded to the census in the same way that their neighbors have in Kew Gardens, once again leaving them at a disadvantage when it comes to our understanding of the types of resources that are going to need to be invested in this neighborhood to ensure that they have their fair share of access to money, power, and respect. And so as a result of this, we've been working very hard to partner with many different organizations across the city to ensure that we are providing linguistically and culturally competent assistance, direct one-on-one assistance, even at a time of COVID-19, to help New Yorkers complete the census, visiting food banks all over Corona and all over Richmond Hill, visiting houses of worship, working with people who are standing in line to receive services, to receive food, to help them complete the census. And this is the type of outreach we're going to continue to need over the coming months to ensure that we do address these disparities and have a complete and accurate count here in New York City. Of course, the examples I've given you repeat themselves in various parts of the city. We can see similar disparities in Brooklyn and the Bronx. And so it's really critically important that we understand how these disparities work and that we all work collectively to ensure that our communities, our neighborhoods, our families have all completed the 2020 census. So thank you, Meeta, so much for giving me a few minutes to talk about our work, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so very much, Amit. I think one takeaway I have from your presentation is that a little competition in the census context is not a bad thing. Like, you can look to the other borough and say they're doing better than we are, and just, motivate yourself to best that. So I want to turn it over now to Lucia Gomez, who's the political director at the Central Labor Council, and she has been doing incredible census work. The labor movement in New York has been doing incredible census work, and we wanted to make sure she was here to explain the work that has been done, why the groups she works with find the census so central to the work that needs to be done for our society, and also, again, once again, how this is part of our path forward. So Lucia, over to you.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm really happy to be on here. I have to admit, I'm one of those that, live and breathe census, coming up with little strategies on how in the middle of the night we can put a message up when people wake up in the morning. But I have to admit that, while I have a drive and a passion and love for census, this is my third census that I've been able to actually actively participate in, other than, filling out my form. But our affiliates have been taking this to a whole other level with their different locals across the city and the state. And so I wanted to give an opportunity to kind of highlight some of those things, how strategically they've been thinking about their communications with members, the role that their members and the families in these neighborhoods play to kind of uplifting the numbers, but at the same time, the communication during this time of the pandemic, right? So, labor is in a very unique position, I would say, because we have ongoing communication with our members before COVID and during COVID even more so, and have upped our game at being able to ensure that our members have the information they need to be active participants in their communities throughout this entire pandemic, and then the economic crisis that we are living in, we will be living in. And then at the end of the day, the social unrest in terms of the racial inequality and disparities that are essentially reflected when when we see the final census numbers, the redistricting that happens, which is I would say that's my first favorite. Census has to happen in order for my first favorite to actually work properly. But we will see the impact that census data will have in all of our neighborhoods across the city, union and non-union alike. New York City is one of the largest, most dense labor city in the country. And so for us, it was of utmost importance that our members hear from us why census is important. And as a result, I think our members and our affiliates have taken things to, like I said, to a level where, you have organizations, institutions like the United Federation of Teachers, right, that saw their role integral in terms of engaging not just students, right, but the parents and understanding the role that they play. And so, I just want to take a minute to kind of share some of the stuff that I've seen and I want to highlight, because I thought they took their creativity and the importance of their role, how they saw it, was pretty amazing. So this is the UFT site, right? In terms of their communications with their members. This doesn't even touch upon, half of everything that they've been doing, both creating curriculum, or not creating, but just sharing and being able to develop curriculum during the pandemic and being able to speak to students. But this is just an idea. They share this with their members. They created a video that they've encouraged their members to share. They've break down Title I funding for education and our schools. I mean, you want to talk about the neighborhoods with overcrowding of schools. It's a lack of being able to plan properly, and aside from all the other political factors, but the planning without, understanding how many kids really live in some of these areas. And so when, Amit was talking about Corona, one of the most overcrowded school systems, areas, districts in the city is the Corona area and the lack of planning. So these are just some of the things that the UFT put together so that they can compile it for their staff. One of the things we realized immediately is that our affiliates basically just needed info. So what we did, CSA, I just want to take you to the mainframe of our site. This was the labor count site, right? It was our way ultimately to track our progress. Not just, informing members and letting people just, see if they filled it out or not, but we wanted to see how successful we were. And so we've asked individuals to take the pledge, right, and to get counted. And if they wanted to be taken to the Bureau site, then they would just add their contact information, right? It's like an organizing tool, and then complete the census. In the bottom, we inform them, you know, in English and Spanish about the importance of being counted. We've gotten on this pledge almost 3,000, I would say, individuals who have taken the pledge. You know, as soon as you fill it out, you get taken directly to the Census Bureau's website, so you're counted. So we've asked all our affiliates to use the Labor Counts 2020 site, just so that we can engage with them. We've partnered with Working America, which is a national affiliate of the National AFL-CIO, the Consortium for Worker Education, which happens to also be a grantee of the cities, and obviously the Central Labor Council, which, you know, our role is to basically provide resources and convenings and opportunities for our members to have the information that they need. You have PSC CUNY, who did a great job at actually promoting jobs and promoting this work to CUNY students and to their professors and the individuals that make up their members. So Professional Staff Congress over at CUNY has been ongoing at doing this work. DC 37, you know, has been doing a lot of one-on-ones and check-ins and blasting, using Hustle and using different tools. I think it's been incredible, the way in which we've used resources that we already have. It wasn't like, you know, we needed to reinvent the wheel and start anew for census or acquire these things and learn them. But at the same time, folks, you know, in the labor movement, we use these tools to mobilize our members in other ways. And so why not use, you know, what we already do and convert it for census for some time. In 2019, in February, our executive board decided that census was going to be one of our priority campaigns, that we would try and ensure that our members at a minimum were engaged as much as possible. And so that work has been coming along for all this time. And they've gotten to the point where you had La Una create their own website to capture their members' info. They, you know, tagged, and this is stuff that didn't need to necessarily, you know, it wasn't necessarily that they created everything. But as an example, I'm a Local 78 member, and once you submit it, you get taken directly to the website, right, to the Census Bureau's website. And so we did this in order, and they did this in order to facilitate that type of, you know, branding with their local, the way in which members associate with their unions was important for the unions to tie that with census information, because as a trusted, you know, institution in the lives of so many workers, we wanted to make sure that they understood why census was so important to our industries. It is what, you know, gives us money for schools, bridges and tunnels, construction projects and development, right? We're talking about funding for our cities and state governments that provide and have and service so many of the workers, you know, within the public sector. You know, when you get services from the city level, right, all that funding actually comes from the federal government. And so if you don't have an accurate count of the constituents that live in a particular city, then as workers, you know, we get deprived from being able to properly service, you know, the constituents, to be able to develop new projects and assess where the needs are based on a lot of different factors. Because remember, census is just one building block of data that gets built on health indicators, that gets built on labor indicators, just a series. So every decennial, that data is just, you know, the basics. It helps us build upon other data sets that give us more accurate depictions of the census. You had the retirees at PEP, at the Public Employees Federation, that communicated with their members about, you know, making sure they're not scammed, right? Because the elderly, especially during this time, the robocalls, the this call, the this reminder, they're not sure who's talking to them. And so I think it was critical for different organizations to take on a different role. Amalgamated Transit Union, which is our bus operators, right? Really hard hit during census, made sure that they had their census messaging. I know used whatever tools they had at their disposal to talk about the importance of census. And I have to admit, CSCA, and I'm trying to see if I can, yeah, there you go. CSCA even had trinkets that they created for their members, and they're the State Employees Association, right? A part of AFSCME at the state level, but they did a whole bunch of stuff, like where they were, you know, raffling out iPads to their members. And again, you know, organizations like us can do these kinds of, you know, one-on-one activities, you know, in group and to our members that perhaps is too massive for the public, right? Although I know the city of New York took it upon themselves to do some of this public outreach, which we've shared to our members. And so, you know, for us, it is just natural to be engaged on census the way we're naturally engaged on ensuring that our members are empowered, whether it's political campaigns, whether it's issues right now on PPE, right? And making sure that safety measures are put in place so that workers can come back and feel like they're safe at the workplace, you know, are just natural ways for us to communicate, keep our members and families safe, and then ensure that the census data actually reflects those populations. We right now take seriously at being strategic about our outreach. So, you know, in the last, I would say, probably about a month, tracking data based on where we have member density, in coordination with the Consortium for Worker Education and the Census Project, we have been able to make over 75,000 calls to members, been able to, at least at a minimum right now, we're at about 20K of pledges of people saying, yes, I filled out the form, or no, I didn't fill it out, but I will. And then we walk them through the process of being able to fill out their form. So we're trying as much as possible to track how much activity our labor unions are creating around census. And I know recently there's an article about, you know, those individuals that fled the city during the peak in the pandemic and where those neighborhoods are. And, you know, the messages across the board are the rich are not filling out the form, but our communities of color, you know, are doing their job, are trying as much as possible to get the message out. And, you know, I find it interesting, the messaging that is being shared about, you know, those individuals with higher academic or financial circumstances not filling out the form. Well, the reality is that if we don't all fill out the form, everyone is screwed, right? Like everyone will be negatively impacted if, you know, if they don't fill out the form. So, you know, while in the past, I would say we had a lot of conversations about the citizenship question and the damage that that was going to do for our communities, we realized that everyone, you know, rich, poor, Black, white, Latino, Asian, there are their own barriers to filling out the form. And while we want to focus and we need to focus on those hardest hit communities with the lowest response rates, I also want to make sure that at a minimum, those communities that are most, that are going to need as many dollars to rebuild their communities post-census, post-COVID, and essentially almost post-census, are going to have the resources they need. So I don't want to divert our efforts out of, you know, to neighborhoods that perhaps are not filling it out because they just don't feel like it, or, you know, are waiting for another paper form, or waiting, you know, when you still have internet access, when you still have, you know, the ability to fill out the form in your language, and essentially the majority in the English language from when I look at the maps, then there's no excuse. You're not filling out the form because you choose not to, not necessarily because you don't have the information and the resources at your fingertips. So we do emphasize being able to reach communities of color, being able to reach our members in the hardest hit neighborhoods, regardless of race, ethnicity, and attainment, because at the end of the day, our unions, you know, reach all their members, regardless of where they live in the city, except we've been targeting and being strategic. So that being said, I want to thank you for having me, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so very, very much, Lucia. Next up, I want to introduce Lurie Daniel-Faber, who is the Interim Executive Director and General Counsel at the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College, CUNY. Did I get that all? So 2 things you need to know about Lurie. Some of us don't know why that word interim exists before executive director. The second thing you need to know about Lurie is there's a reason why she's our last panelist speaking, which is the rest of us have learned that we don't want to speak after Lurie. So with that introduction, Lurie, I'm going to let you take it over.
And now I'm just going to laugh about that for the rest of the day. Mita, I just want to say thank you so much for putting you and everyone at New York Counts who helped pull this together. I think it is just fantastic, and I'm very much appreciative. Thank you, Senator Myrie, for being that super census warrior. We appreciate you. We appreciate having elected officials who know how to center the issues of the community squarely within the confines of the civic engagement discussion. And this is certainly an example where that's necessary. And of course, a huge thank you to all the panelists. I am in extraordinarily good company and with people who I consider to be friends and brothers and sisters in the census. So I am very honored to be able to have this conversation. And so I don't have like a whole bunch of slides that I'm going to share. I actually do want to share one image that I think will sort of help contextualize what it is that we have been contemplating at the Center for Law and Social Justice. And if you'll notice, and just to be clear, the Center for Law and Social Justice is a racial justice law center. And so our perspective on the issues of census, on issues of redistricting, voting rights, racial violence and policing, educational equity, cultural rights, is all framed within a perspective that centers racial justice, particularly the needs of New Yorkers of African descent. And so for us, this image of a complete and whole community circle with only 1/3 shaded in really is essential for our way of interpreting and sort of engaging with the census within our community. And so the reason that's important is because if you're thinking about a hospital that you may have had to visit or receive services from, or if you're thinking about a school where your children are enrolled, or if you're thinking about a bus that you hope is being sufficiently disinfected, if you're thinking about a senior center where some elder in your family or your community is currently receiving services, I want you to think about all of the many ways that we rely on our schools, our hospitals, our transportation, our services for seniors, and think about having 2/3 of those funding sources for those spaces functionally removed. And that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about the census. And for us at the Center for Law and Social Justice, we had all of the issues that many of the other panelists have spoken about, plus an overlay of 400 years of systemic anti-Black oppression that has created a really firmly grounded and rational fear of government and fear of sharing of information. And so that is sort of the umbrella and the cloud, I guess, under which we had to approach our census activism. Having said that, as everyone has noted, the coronavirus completely disrupted everyone's plans. We had been working on our census campaign since 2017 when we convened the New York City Black Leadership Advisory Coalition for Census 2020, which was the only Pan-African coalition that was designed on a citywide basis to communicate with the Pan-African diaspora about what the census is, how it works, and to dispel the 400-year history of mistrust and sort of explain what the census, how the census is fundamentally tied to our everyday affairs. And it has been a wonderful experience. I have had a phenomenal time working with many of the people on this call. And then came the coronavirus. And what the coronavirus did was it didn't so much create the inequities, it just showed us just how glaring those inequities actually are. And so if you're thinking about the communities, particularly communities of African descent that were the most impacted by the virus, either in terms of infection rates and in terms of prospects for making out of that hospital alive. You're also looking at communities, if you were to lay them over with a map, and Steve, I'm just gonna shout you out for all your excellent map work. If you were to overlay those with a map of low community census response rates in 2010, you're going to see almost a mirror image. And part of the reason that is because our hospitals are funded in part based on census dollars. And so if you live in a community that had a very poor medical response to the coronavirus, chances are that is in some way related to the fact that in 2010, that very same community did not have sufficient enough numbers in the census count, meaning they did not literally have the population to justify additional investment in healthcare, to justify maintained or continued investment in healthcare spaces. The senator mentioned he's got 4 hospitals in his district. Well, as a result of population shifts and patterns, we have lost almost 20,000 medical beds, the funding and the capacity for those medical beds over the past 2 decades, largely in communities where if you're not showing up on the census, it's like, I often talk about the Avengers because I love the movie when Thanos snaps his finger and half the universe disappears. It's literally as though 2/3 of our community is not showing up for the purposes of government business planning, for government allocation of resources, and for the allocation of votes and political power. And so coming from a community of African descent, when you are already dealing with systemic anti-Black oppression, when you're already dealing with the institutionalization of white supremacy, and you are not showing up on the census, we end up protesting on the back end for things that were not properly funded at the front end because we were not engaged in that process. What does that look like? A lot of the protests that I've been involved in over the past several years include things like protesting for better quality schools, protesting for and advocating for African history to be taught in schools so that children of African descent know who they are and receive a culturally responsive education, protesting against police violence and advocating for community policing programs, protesting against a ton of things, advocating for money for cure violence programs, for Save Our Streets programs, advocating for all of these programs and services which are largely funded by census dollars. But when we don't show up and fill out the census, we disappear from all of the governmental mathematic formulas that determine how much money our communities are going to get. We end up living in underfunded and under-resourced and under-politically represented communities. And then we have to protest for the funding for the things that we need, when if we had showed up on the census 10 years ago, we would have that funding. Now, I am not at all suggesting that if we fill out the census, there is not a reason to protest. Trust me, I'm a protest baby, and I firmly believe that that is a right and that is a muscle that must be healthily activated and exercised and used. However, imagine living in a community where you're not dealing with 1/3 of a school being funded. Think about the schools you went to in New York City. Were they fully funded? Think about the transportation services you receive in New York City. Are they equitably distributed? Do you live in a community like East New York or Bedford-Stuyvesant, where when you go into the subway station, you have to hold your nose because it smells so unpleasant? Or do you live in a community downtown Brooklyn or on the Upper West Side, where it looks like overnight someone came in and put up a beautiful mosaic mural and you're just amazed at how gorgeous the lighting is? So these types of discrepancies, yes, are a function of systematic racist distribution of resources, but it's also a function of the fact that people who live in better funded communities tend to fill out the census at higher rates than people who do not. And so I would be remiss if I did not also just add, and I know, Mita, we're coming to an end. I'm going to try to put a neat little button on this. But I think it's just also very important that we create and hold space for the fact that there are valid reasons why people of African descent in this city do not fill out the census. And as I've said many times before, and as people far more brilliant than I have elucidated in phenomenal ways, the first time communities of African descent show up on the census is in 1790, and that was as 3/5 of a person, because even at the inception of this country, the racial manipulation of data was being used to determine who was going to get access to resources and power. So it makes perfect sense that we do not want to give our information over to the government. We only got the right to register to vote in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act, which was not the first Voting Rights Act, but that's a history lesson for another time. Which means that if you know someone who's 58, 59, 60 years old, they're literally older than the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, all of which are the 3 pillars upon which integration in this country relies. So it's not like we have had access to this system. In fact, for most of our time in this country, we were proactively excluded from participating in the system. So that lack of knowledge is valid. However, those of you who grow up in the Christian tradition know that there is a reference that says the people are destroyed for what? A lack of knowledge. And so in addition to worrying about systematic oppression, we also have to be clear that part of our role as census educators and as people who are active in various communities is looking at the history of the communities with which we are working, centering that history in our census plans, in our formulations, in our communications, and in our discourse, and being able to create a message and create outreach programs that are going to bring all of those things together so we can move from an image that has only 1/3 of our community resources being funded, only 1/3 of our political power being distributed, so that we are fully represented, fully empowered, fully equitably funded, so that when we protest, it won't have to be for things like affordable housing and healthy food options in our communities. And I'll leave it there.
Preach.
Thanks, Mita.
Okay, so I would be remiss if I didn't say, I think the same is also true for our immigrant communities, where there's been like deliberate efforts to suppress our immigrant communities being counted. And, that's why everyone was all in and fighting against the citizenship question, because of how much that would increase the fears of the immigrant community and how the data will be used. And of course, we have the history of internment and Japanese American internment camps. Not trying to get into all the bad things, but just to say, we recognize our communities have these fears and we understand why. And that's why we also understand it's so important that we're all out there educating and emphasizing the importance of this. And the whole attempt to suppress is because the people who are suppressing understand the power that the data holds. So I am going to open this up for questions. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box or the Q&A box. While we wait for that to come in, I'm just going to take a moment to thank certain people that helped put this all together. Carlos Rosales from the Citizens Committee for Children, Aaron Flores from Bibliosol, Jin Bay from Queens Public Library, Jeff Weiss from New York Law School, Natalie Bernstein from New York Immigration Coalition. Everyone has just been unbelievable in helping to arrange for this incredible week that we have in front of us. Of course, I thank our panelists, but I'll be thanking you again later. Thank you, and thank you for all of your organization's work. While we're waiting for questions, I wanted to just, I'm going to ask the same question of each of you. It'll be slightly different for Steve, which is about like, what are we seeing in terms of effective outreach to combat exactly these things that we're talking about? And my variant for it for Steve is, you know, I noticed on your charts every now and then, the line drawings, there'd be like a little jump up, like a little noticeable change. Have you, Steve, seen in your data, like the positive effect of outreach? Like, are you seeing, yes, when you see a targeted outreach action, you see an effect? Steve?
Sorry, I didn't know if I was going to go, you wanted me to go first.
Thank you.
So yes, you definitely can see some jumps up in the rates. And earlier on in the self-response operation, it was easier to see increases in the rates in local areas based on outreach because the rates started out low, and it was when they jumped up, it was more obvious. Some of the increases that you see in those lines are from Census Day, when there was a huge national outreach effort to remind people to respond on or around April 1st, and they definitely did. So that was great. There was definitely a bump up in mid-June when a lot of the responses that had been mailed in from so-called update leave areas all of a sudden got processed in one weekend from the Census Bureau. And so that logjam broke, and a bunch of increases, a bunch of responses got processed, and the rates went up. And you could definitely see, though, in some areas, I don't know enough about all of the local outreach activities, but groups that are closer to the field and on the ground have told me that, they'll look at areas where they did a caravan or, coordinated outreach, or some of the efforts that Lucia and Lurie were talking about. And they've said, yes, you could definitely see an increase in the rates. So it definitely helps to, be able to visualize that.
Thank you, Steve. Amit, firstly, I wanted to emphasize one thing to the people who've joined us. New York Counts 2020 is a statewide effort. We've included New York City census for the very reason that New York City is a huge portion of New York State, and because, as you pointed out, New York City has the largest coordinated municipal effort around the census within the United States. But I did want to emphasize, like, everyone here wants all of New York State to be counted. It's just being done in different ways. But with that said, Amit, what have you seen, especially, as we've gone through the various phases of the pandemic, as being effective outreach?
Sure, that's a really good question. And, we've seen that there are really different strategies and tactics that work differently with different communities. We've seen that there are some parts of the city where we have invested in additional reminder mailings, for example. So these are mailings that are in addition to what the US Census Bureau has sent out to their, as postcards reminding folks to participate in the census. And we found that in some parts of the city, these have been effective. In other parts of the city, we've seen that when we choose to invest a little bit more heavily in digital advertising that is done in culturally and linguistically appropriate ways, that we do see small increases relative to other places where the advertising investment has been less. But one of the key tactics that we have really been investing our human resources in recently, which we have found has been certainly very effective in terms of the nature and tone and tenor of the response that we're getting, is doing as much in-person census completion assistance as we possibly can. Obviously, this is entirely voluntary. It's something that we do taking all of the precautions we possibly can, ensuring that our staff or anyone else who's volunteering to assist in this way is fully equipped with all the PPE that they need and is trained in best practices in terms of how to engage with folks. But we have now done close to 40 events across the city in 6 weeks where our staff or staff of our Complete Count Fund awardees have gone and worked with New Yorkers who are very unfortunately standing in some incredibly long lines waiting to receive free food and other resources because they find that they are unable to access these resources as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have seen that these lines are long, very frighteningly long in many different boroughs. This is particularly acute in Queens. And so what we've been doing is literally going and having those one-on-one conversations, exactly the type of one-on-one conversations that we would have had in much larger numbers and at a much greater scale were we able to all these past months when, if we had not had the COVID-19 pandemic. When we do go out and do engage in this type of activity, we have found by and large that the response is quite positive. We are very committed to ensuring that we have speakers of the relevant languages who are actually speaking to these New Yorkers. Being able to establish that direct connection and break down that cultural and linguistic barrier is the very foundation on which we can establish a basis of trust and then actually communicate the importance of the census and also the safety of the census, right? Speaking to someone who you immediately can establish a trusting relationship with is really key to being able to do that. So we look forward to doing as much of that as we possibly can, hopefully increasing those efforts. I'll make a quick plug and then I'll wrap it up. Provided that we continue to see the type of progress here in New York that we've been seeing over the last several weeks in terms of COVID infections, we're going to continue to do this type of work. If anyone who's participating in this webinar would like to assist us and you are a speaker of Spanish or South Asian languages, East Asian languages, those are the real needs, please feel free to contact us. Mita will ensure that the right contact information is posted in the chat. We really need all the help we can get. Thank you.
Thank you, Amit. Lucia, I'm going to pose the same question to you. Like, what have you seen has really resonated in terms of outreach to the various union members?
We always see an uptick when we have these town halls or when we have our delegate meetings or, we've been having bi-weekly meetings of all our labor coordinators, giving them all the latest information, providing them with all the social media links, other events that are taking place. We do see the numbers on our end go up when there is some kind of event like this, right? Where folks are like, oh, wow, look, I should do that. So, I would say the more, that at least our affiliates have opportunities to hold monthly meetings virtual right now, any chance that we get to actually mention it at other types of town halls that we've had, whether it was, on, labor leaders discussion during all the social unrest and social unrest that still is taking place. But, during that time we had a pretty great conversation and town hall where our affiliates participated and we saw the numbers go up. I would actually, one of the most missed opportunities that I see, and our members are watching, is New York State governor's, briefings. Anytime the governor, I know I was on 11 o'clock, 11:30. Why is he moving it to 12:30? You're messing up my schedule. Some of the missed opportunities are the fact that, our members in particular, they're watching they're watching for the updates. They need to know when they're going to be able to safely go back or what the changes are, the brand new states that are being added. I am astounded that, Census hasn't been, one of the concrete messages that get shared. I would say that one of the things that really does work is, our voices out on social media. Our members are watching, whether they're watching on their cell phones or they're watching at home on their laptops. At least for labor, our members are paying attention to these kinds of activities and reports. And so it's going to be critical. Even our essential workers and our frontline workers, our nurses, NISNA, our Nurses Association has been ridiculously incredible at using the census message throughout all their rallying points from the start of the pandemic. And these are individuals in the front lines that are worried about, protecting themselves or their community. So there's really no excuse why, we can't have trusted leaders, like Senator Myrie, for those that watch his, podcast, listen to his podcast, uses the mic, use the damn mic, use Zoom, use any tool necessary to make sure people are simply reminded and that it's important to you. And I would say, I know that at some point, de Blasio perhaps is not the best messenger at this time, right? And I know he has used census in some of his briefings, but I would say the governor and every of the commission members on census should be, using their tools and their audiences to raise the noise, because I know our members are watching and will be probably really appreciative that they use their, their mic time to do that.
Lurie, I know you have stuff to say. I see it.
So I think that if we are, the senator started out by saying some of his colleagues call him Mr. Census, and which I think is hilarious. And awesome and quite true, considering the type of work that we see coming out of Senator Myrie's office and even Assemblymember Richardson's office. I feel like those two elected officials have set a really good model for what effective communication about the census looks like. It is unfortunate, however, that people who are referring to the senator as Mr. Census are not asking themselves, how do I become more like Mr. Census, right? So I know that, some elected officials have sent out an item or two. Every single time you get to a microphone, you need to be talking about the census. If you are an elected official and you either have constituents, want to continue having constituents, want to be effective for your constituents, at this point in time, other than engaging in mass protests in a socially distanced, safe way as possible, filling out your census is literally the easiest, most powerful way you can make a fundamental, concrete difference within your community, and then getting your friends to do so as well. I echo I lament the fact that while the governor did a wonderful series of 100+ days of communication with the population. Right now, worldwide, people are paying attention to Cuomo's, the Governor Cuomo's press conferences. I don't believe that he's mentioned the census more than once. And so to be in as precarious a situation as we are, because right now, the pandemic isn't so much about what is happening. Like, we celebrated this week the first time that New York City had 0 deaths from this pandemic, which is something that actually made me cry when I first heard about it, because it was just, there's been so much loss and so much suffering that we have endured that we're now seeing replicated across the country. Recovery is literally going to be all we're concerned with, we're consumed with from now until we are completely out of this mess, which thanks to, well, I'm not going to get too political. I know this is not partisan, so let me reshift. But you know where I'm going with this. Recovery is all we're going to be consumed with. Recovery costs money. We're talking about whether or not children can go to school this year. And I've seen, many of you I'm sure have seen, that schools can hardly control a lice infestation, let alone a COVID outbreak. We're talking about whether or not we have enough access to materials for children if they're going to stay home. We're talking about whether or not the subways are going to be able to sustain the return of people to the workforce. We're talking every single thing we are talking about as it pertains to recovery from this pandemic is tied to money, dollars, cents, and political power. And if we are not centering that in every single communication that we have, every single opportunity that we have to get on the mic, we are fundamentally selling our communities short of what it is that they're going to need to survive. And I just think that, there was a question in the chat about whether or not we're activating religious communities, whether or not we're activating, small businesses. Let me tell you, before this virus, we had faith-based communities, or faith-based organizations, community-based, interreligious, interdisciplinary, education services. We had a barbershop, hair salon, and daycare center outreach program, because those are the spaces where Black people are most present. And then everything was upended. So we right now have been joining our efforts at the food distribution centers, because that is, as Amit said, that's where the people are. They're standing in line for food, again, because we do not have enough funding to ensure that people's everyday needs are met. And so that's sort of where we have shifted a lot of our efforts. Now, we're actually hiring right now. Sorry, I got to use this time to take a plug, Mita. So if you visit our website, clsj.org/employment, you will see that we are actually hiring, because we are trying to beef up our team of people who can appear at food distribution and mutual aid centers to ensure that people, yes, are getting access to their aid, but they're also getting access to the 5-10 minutes that it's going to take for them to fill out the census, and they're literally standing in line looking for some sort of engagement. And so that's sort of how we've had to nimbly shift our focus and our emphasis. And Mita, I don't even quite frankly know if I answered your question. I can't remember the question right now.
Oh, I just wanted you to speak. So
Okay.
good. Yeah. So we have a question. Firstly, I know we scheduled this to go till 12:15. I'm fine going to 12:30. If anyone needs to drop off, no harm, no foul. But I think we can just keep this going till 12:30 just to answer a few more questions, and then call it a day for now till we get to tomorrow. There was one question in the chat about volunteer opportunities. I will take that. If you are in New York City, I would direct you towards New York City Census. Amit did put an email address in the chat for those of us on Zoom, and it was CLONGO@census.nyc.gov. If you are outside New York City, New York Counts 2020 does do weekly phone and text banking. Just head over to our website and sign up at newyorkcounts2020.org. And if none of that suits your needs, feel free to email me, Anand, at nyic.org, and I can look to hook you up with a representative in your local area. I do want to say it doesn't actually matter where you are to do phone and text banking, because that's just all done socially distant. So like, we host text banking and phone banking from New York Counts 2020 for all over New York State, Rochester, Buffalo, Newburgh, you name it. And I do it from, Manhattan. So you don't have to be where you are, like where you want to reach out to. For in-person volunteer opportunities, though, it would be connecting with your local census outreach people. And Laurie has put some information. I'll ask people who are helping us administratively wise to put this information in the chat for Facebook Live, for our Facebook Live viewers. So we have a question about, due to the pandemic, did we think underrepresentation would still be a problem? I suspect where the question is going is somewhere not very pleasant, but it's more, do we think because of the pandemic, like we're still going to see some issue of not counting what our true numbers are? So Laurie, I think I'm gonna send that one over to you just because your mic is on, your mute is off.
Sure. Yes, it is still, it's actually more of an issue now, at least for the communities that I'm connected to, than it was beforehand. Right now, even though I know the discrepancy between where we are now and where we were in 2010 is not necessarily as great, coming in at 51-52% is not at all a winning proposition. And so being very concerned, not only that people who have all the traditional fears and resistance points to the census that already existed, now being worried about healthcare costs, being worried about all of the other things that are laid on top of it, being unemployed, knowing that your job is likely not coming back if you're unemployed. These are all things that are even more contributing factors to underrepresentation and lack of submission on census for the census form. And so I think for us, it's more of an issue now than it was in the past, added to the fact that we just don't have the ability to directly reach people in the same ways that we did. So virtual is great. I think all of us did as great a job as we possibly could in terms of pivoting, but it is simply not the same to have a Zoom as it is to show up on a Saturday morning at a Black-owned barbershop or hair salon that is full and buzzing and teeming with people, where you can do an impromptu, let's everyone pull out our cell phones to fill out the census while we're getting our hair done.
Yeah, and I mean, Mita, I just want to, you know, when people take a look at the number of their city council member or of their senator or of their congressional person, just realize that when we draw congressional, we start in Long Island, right? And work our way towards New York City, and then we build around. When we start city council districts, you start in District 1 in southern, you know, Manhattan, and then you work your way around to the Bronx and Queens and Brooklyn, because that's just geography, and it, in the past, has been where we've started in order to protect, you know, communities that have made major gains and communities of color throughout the city. So just think about that. In Manhattan alone, you're starting with Chinatown and the financial district, right? With communities of color for a while, you know, in that have been trying to maintain that seat, Lower East Side. Then you have, you know, the center of Manhattan, which it looks very different, which data and going up all the way up to 96th Street is telling us that the numbers are low. But then you start off again in Harlem, and you start off again in East Harlem, and loop up around, you know, in Upper Manhattan, where the struggle is real, you know, looping into the Bronx. I mean, underrepresentation is no joke, you know, when we don't have enough, and when you're not getting an accurate count, even though we know the people are there. The housing stock is there, and we may not be getting the numbers that that we should. So reality is that, yes, underrepresentation has always been an ongoing conversation for all communities, but even more so because, you know, if certain communities at a minimum don't enter what they're supposed to be expected wise, we're gonna have even less representation in communities of color throughout the city.
Thank you, Lucia. We have a question about can anyone speak to organizing efforts to ensure that people with disabilities are counted, particularly those who live in group homes? Amit, I think I'm going to throw that one to you. I know that CCF has funded some groups that do organizing in that space, and maybe you can walk us through what the group home count looks like too.
Sure. Thank you so much. I hope folks don't have trouble hearing me. I had to switch rooms due to an internet connection issue, and the air conditioning is on. So as far as ensuring that folks with disabilities are enumerated, we do have a couple of organizations that are focused on working with people with disabilities here in New York City that are part of the Complete Count Fund awardee universe, and I'm happy to follow up with whomever asked the question directly to provide, you know, more detailed information. For those folks who live in group homes, the United States Census Bureau has a very particular procedure that they follow that ensures a complete and accurate count of everyone who's living in what's known as a quote unquote group quarters. So this includes group homes, excuse me. This also includes college dorms, and other similar facilities where you have large numbers of individuals living together. The U.S. Census Bureau works directly with these homes to ensure that the homes are actually made accessible to United States Census Bureau enumerators, or that the leadership of the homes themselves actually conducts a type of survey that is essentially a proxy survey on behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau, and then provides that information directly to the U.S. Census Bureau. By and large, this methodology of counting tends to be relatively complete and accurate. The U.S. Census Bureau does have a complete and accurate list of all of the group homes in New York City and New York State. And they do know how to reach each of the executive directors and the leadership, and have been working on this process for months. The group quarters enumeration has taken on different variations because of COVID-19, but the Census Bureau continues to conduct this process and will continue to conduct it through the rest of the summer. I just want to make one very quick note. Here in New York City, we've also gotten a question very commonly about how the population of homeless New Yorkers is counted. We're very proud to say that for the first time in history, New York City, under our leadership here at New York City Census 2020, inked an unprecedented deal with the United States Census Bureau to provide a complete and accurate tally of every single person in shelter here in New York City, which we have now done. 95% plus of those folks experiencing homelessness here in New York City actually live in shelter because we are legally provided. We're legally mandated to provide shelter to those folks experiencing homelessness. That count has been completed. The United States Census Bureau will be conducting its own count of those folks experiencing homelessness unsheltered in September.
Thank you, Amit. So we're fast running out of what I promised would be the new time. I do want to uplift what Carlos Rosales from CCC, who has been an invaluable partner to all of us in so many ways and in putting this together, has put in our chat box for those who are not looking at the chat box on Zoom, which is for anyone interested in connecting regarding counting young children 0 to 4 in the census. You can reach out to him, Carlos Rosales, Citizens Committee for Children of New York, crosales@cccnewyork.org. And Lurie, there's a question, I think you can answer it pretty quickly about plans to motivate the Black community to fill out the census. I mean, not that it's a short answer, but I think you can, there's a lot of plans, but I think you can wrap that up quickly. And then roll straight into what I want to have as a wrap-up question for each of us, which is, what gives you hope that we're going to get this done?
So one, thank you for the question. And yes, there are many things and many organizations that are working to excite and motivate the communities of African descent throughout the city of New York to fill out the census. And I say communities of African descent specifically because we are approaching this from a Pan-African perspective. And so you can visit our website, clsj.org, get on our mailing list. You will see that we are frequently sending out information about how people can get involved. On our website, there is a form for faith-based organizations and community-based groups, elected officials. If you would like a census presentation for your constituency, for your congregation, for your attendees, please contact us and let us know. We are happy to provide one. We are continuing our partnership with organizations like the Brooklyn NAACP, Harlem Complete Count Committee, other groups that are already doing this work from an African-centered approach. And so if you are looking for ways to get involved, please reach out to us. I'm happy to add you to the team. We don't send too many emails, but we try to make sure the emails that we do send are full of ways that you can get involved. In addition to, as I said before, we are hiring. And so we need people, and we're not paying as well as the Census Bureau. I will just put that out there because we are a humble little organization, but for people who are looking for additional ways to get involved and support themselves a bit additionally financially, we definitely provide that opportunity as well. What gives me hope is that we're still here, right? We're still having these conversations. We are still, I have not seen most of you folks in person in months, which is a dramatic 180 turn from seeing you like every single day of the week in all different boroughs. We are still here. We are still vibrant. We are still active, we are still passionate, and we are still using the tools that we have at our disposal to the best extent that we possibly can to continue pressing forward. There are, I will be perfectly honest, many nights where I'm like, what the heck is happening? And how is it that all of these things can go wrong at the same time? And yet, the next day, there will be calls, there are meetings. You've got Mr. Census, Senator Myrie. You've got, people who are taking this so seriously and pressing forward and centering it. That to me is the most important thing, that we are still centering this issue in the midst of everything else that's happening and finding ways to be as nimble as possible to adjust and sort of just absorb the blows and deflect them like a suit in Wakanda. I don't know. But those are the things that give me hope, because at the end of the day, we still have work to do. And I stand on the shoulders of ancestors and many people who suffered with far worse than what we're dealing with right now. And so I draw strength from that history, and I use the wisdom that my elders have provided for me and apply that to what's happening right now in hopes that my children and your children will have opportunities and access in ways that I could only dream of. So those are the things that give me hope.
Lucia, what brings you hope?
I would say, I'm actually, what brings me hope is our kids, right? The fact that we have young people out there, you know, kind of holding it down for all of those that either it's past our time, right? Or, you know, we want to be supportive, or we also have to think about, you know, much broader repercussions, you know, in being exposed with COVID. It brings me hope that they're keeping the message strong out there, to be honest with you, during this pandemic, and the opportunity that, you know, I have as a mom to my 13-year-old to have that time to educate her through that process, through that thought process and answer. So to be honest with you, like, what brings me hope is the fact that we have family, and those that don't, we can bring them, you know, some solace and understanding that, you know, we're out there also fighting for them, and struggle. The struggle is real. And what gives me hope is all our frontline workers and our essential workers that have not given up on us, you know, because they could have just said, I am not going to work, I'm going to stay home, I'm scared, and all these elements. But they took upon the challenge, and they've been out there for us. So, yeah.
Amit?
It's a great question, Mita. I will have to piggyback on what Lucia just shared. I really do think that all of the frontline workers and essential workers here in New York City have given me a tremendous amount of hope. I will give a very quick plug for our brand new campaign that we have launched called On the Front Lines, where we feature real life on the front line and essential workers here in New York City who are Black New Yorkers, who really have been keeping us safe, fed, keeping New York City clean, keeping New York City moving, protected, who really have not given up, and I think are girding themselves for what unfortunately might be a second wave. And the fact that they are still out there doing the work that they do, which in many ways is thankless, really does give me a lot of hope. And I will also say all of you give me a lot of hope, because despite this completely unprecedented and unexpected challenge that we found ourselves in, everyone's commitment to ensuring a complete and accurate count here in New York City remains totally unwavering. And to see Lurie and Lucia and Steve, and obviously the Senator, and of course Mita, you here doing this work day in, day out, really helps me keep going.
And Steve?
So I would agree with Amit. I think all of the people on the call and all of the organizations that they represent, and all the other worker groups, census stakeholder groups, and trusted partners throughout the city, throughout the state, and really throughout the country, is really inspiring. And you know, many of these groups have been involved and focused on this for the past several years, in addition to work that they may have done in earlier censuses. And so that's really inspiring, and it's very hopeful. So fingers crossed. Great group.
All right, so I was remiss earlier when I was listing who helped put this together. I forgot to mention Hillary Medina Loveless of Census Counts, which is the campaign arm of the Leadership Conference for Civil Rights. She's fantastic, they're fantastic. All of my panelists today were incredibly fantastic. What a way to kick off this week. Thank you to each and every one of you for participating. Thank you to everyone who joined us on Zoom or on Facebook Live. Please join for the rest of the week. Each day is going to be different, and hopefully each day will be inspiring. So thank you very, very much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.